Okay, I forgot to record the first part of this lecture, but if essentially we were talking about API integration terms. I keep forgetting to do that. Note to self, remember. But essentially I was talking about API integration terms. This is an example of sending a request using the fetch command and awaiting the response. Here we process the response as JSON, which is one of the two most common, as we talked about here, one of the most common data return types. I forget where it was written. It's written here, response. So response is typically in JSON or XML format. And then here we are displaying the data as a JSON object that's been already parsed and processed. So what this gets down to is the main point of this lecture, which is state. State is a way to store dynamic data and be able to update data accordingly in a dynamic and interactive way with your website. For example, requesting external content or displaying updates to a UI based off of user interaction. And so why would we use state for API data? Well, it allows us to have dynamic data handling, so we can store, update, and display dynamic data. That means that, say the web page just started and the request is sent, but we're still waiting for the data to come back. Well, in the meantime, while we're waiting for the data to come back, we can display loading, which is in our state variable. So we can say data is loading. And then when the data comes back, let's say it brings back the number 5. Then we can update our state now with the number 5. And the number 5 will be updated. Or let's give the example that the number 5 doesn't come back, but instead an error comes back from the server, and the server says, you tried to access a resource that you didn't have credentials for. It's going to return an error. And so with that, we can update our state by showing an error on our state. So state allows us to manage dynamic data, and it's great when working with API data. It also allows for UI responsiveness, so updating state based on API responses, you can show the real-time data as it becomes available. For example, the weather data is constantly changing. We can reflect real-time changes in the weather using state with our API. So some key benefits are efficient updates, and then also separation of concerns. So isolating the back end versus the front end, and also isolating data appropriately in state is important. So now that we've talked about some basics of state and API, I think it's a good time to review React component types, because React components manage state differently depending on the type. So this applies to both React Native and React.js. A lot of things in React.js applies to React Native, which React Native is used to build mobile apps, while React.js is used to build web applications. So this applies. Class components, there are two types of React components. There are class components and functional components. What components do, and they're one of the key values of using a framework like React.js, components allow us to take our code and modularize it. So for example, say you want to create a custom button and you want to use that everywhere. Creating a React component can allow you to use the same button style everywhere without having to copy and paste a million times in HTML with all of the content. Or say, for example, you want to use the same format for all of your paragraph sections. That allows you to really use the same format and just send the data that you want displayed in the paragraph sections. So components are a way to modularize our code. And there are two types of components. There are class components and functional components. Class components can hold and manage local state, while functional components utilize hooks to manage state. So hooks are essentially ways that we program our functional components to use state using other methods or functions that come from React. So class components have intrinsic state while functional components do not. Class components also have access to lifecycle methods, which we'll talk about in a sec. These include component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. And this basically allows you to determine the life state of your component. So whether or not your component is newly created, whether it's updating, or whether it's about to be deleted. And so the use case for class components is for more complex components or designs. Meanwhile, functional components are typically easier to read, they utilize hooks, and they're more ideal for presentational elements. For example, just basic web elements and ideas with simpler logic. So this is an example of a class component, and I don't think we showed this at last chat. But the way that a class component is structured is we have our class here, and we extend a React component. We use a constructor to basically create our component and our state. So we use, our state is managed with this dot set state, and our state is initialized with this dot state. So our state is going to be an object where we are storing our variables, or like our keys, with our values. So our key here is count, and our value is 0. So we have 0 count in our state at the very beginning. And so then we have this method here, this function called increment. This method essentially allows us to increment our state. So this changes our state by using this dot set state. And the way this dot set state works is that we are giving it a new object to update our state, which is equal to this dot state dot count, which is this current count right now, plus 1. So we are updating our count by changing our state like this. So state is essentially an object that we are basically changing every time we call this increment method. And then here we use the render method, which is what React calls when it's trying to build the actual display. What the render method is going to do is it returns our HTML for the object, or for the component. So here we have a div, which is our section, and inside of that section we have a count paragraph with an updating value for our state count variable. And then in addition to that, we have a button, which when we click it using the onClick function, or onClick attribute, we are basically saying every time that you click this, we are going to run this dot increment, which is this method up here, which will update our state. So this button will increment our state over time. So that's essentially how state works in class components, is we store our state and we initialize our state within our constructor, and then we can change our state using methods like setState. Meanwhile, with functional components, we have to import useState from the React library, which useState is a function for creating, is ultimately an object for creating state. And so what we do instead is some of the key differences of functional components is that we're defining our component with a function. And here's the same exact component that we just saw. It's called counter, but this time instead of defining it with a class and a constructor and methods, we are defining it with a function, objects that are stored inside of the function or sub-functions. And then here we do have a method or a function that we've defined inside of this function called increment. And then we are returning our HTML like we were in previously, but instead of returning it in the render call, we are just returning it from the whole functional component in general. And this returns the same exact thing, except when we are calling our method, we don't use the this keyword. So whenever we're building classes, we reference the methods with the this keyword. For example, updating our state is updating our properties with this dot state. In this case, there is no properties because we're not building a class. There are also no methods because we're not building a class. So instead, we're working with functions and we're working with variables. So our state is going to be generated using this useState function, and this sets our initial state to 0. So 0 is our initial state for our count. So count is initially at 0. And what we're creating is we've created our variable which stores our current count, and we've also created our setCount function which updates the state for this specific variable, which is count. And in this case, to set the count, we increment count by 1. So we take our variable here, and that's our state variable, we add 1 to it, and then we reset our count state using setCount, which is defined here when we create our state in the first place. So that's what we're doing in the increment subfunction. And then here we're returning pretty much the same exact object, except instead of saying this.state.count, we're just referencing count as a variable, and instead of saying this.increment, we are referencing our increment as a function instead of a method of a class. So I hope that makes sense. We manage our state using useState, and that's an example of a React hook. And then we update our state using our useState, the set count that's generated with our useState function. So we just talked about hooks. useState is an example of a hook. Our next set of slides are about lifecycle methods and hooks, which are ways that we manage state and dynamic information in React. So lifecycle methods in React refer to special methods that are called at different stages of a component's existence. For example, componentDidMount is a function that is called upon after the component is mounted, which means that when the component is generated on the page, it will call componentDidMount, and everything inside of that function or that lifecycle method will run, because it'll say, okay, we've now generated the object, the component. Now we're going to say we did it, mission complete. Now what, basically? Then there is componentDidUpdate. This is called whenever a component updates. So that's whenever we change state or the props. And then componentWillUnmount is called before we delete the component. So say we need to clean up a function that's constantly repeating in our component. ComponentWillUnmount will stop that function that's constantly repeating so it doesn't exist in the future. Even if it's an asynchronous function or something along those lines. We can basically set it up so that when ComponentWillUnmount gets called, this method will trigger the stopping of extraneous processes. So, as mentioned previously, lifecycle methods are only featured in class components. So only in our components like this one, where we are defining a class rather than a functional component. So an example of the usage of componentDidMount is here. Here we are using a class component called lifecycleExample. Here's our constructor where we initialize our state. When the component is mounted or it is displayed and rendered initially, we are logging to our console. So we're basically saying print componentDidMount, component mounted. And so this is just basically saying we mounted, we did it, we are rendered. Next, we call the componentDidUpdate whenever the component updates. So whenever the state or props change, this method is going to announce componentDidUpdate. And then if the previous state, if the count in the previous state, which componentDidUpdate takes two arguments. The first argument is called previous props, which is the properties that existed before the state updated, and previous state, which is the state that existed before the component updated. So when this happens, it'll check if the previous state, if the previous count, which was in the previous state, is not equal to the current count. So if the count changes, then it'll print count changed. Meanwhile, we call this method here, component will unmount, when we're about to delete our component, and this will just print component will unmount, component will be removed. So that's how these three lifecycle methods are used in React class components. This is really important, actually, and I'll explain more in a second, but in React, these methods are very important. So React hooks are more often used in functional components. Hooks are functions that allow these components to manage state, side effects, and lifecycle events without needing a class. So there are three main React hooks. There is, and these are just the most popularly used. I've used all three of these. There is use state, which manages state as we've seen previously. There is use effect, which handles side effects. So this is more like asynchronous data and updating data. So this works a lot more similarly to component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, because it'll trigger whenever state is generated, updated, or deleted. And then use context allows components to access values in the context API. So what context does is it provides state for the whole app so that you can share values throughout the entire app. And we'll talk more about that in a sec. So this is the example for use state. The way that use state works, or use state and use effect, is that we have our state here. Our state is, this is a functional component called data fetcher, and what it's going to do is it's going to update our data, which is created with state. Our initial state of our data is null. So at the very beginning, our data variable is equal to null, and set data is a function that we can call to update our data. Now we have use effect here. And what use effect is going to do is it's going to call this asynchronous function called fetch data. And this asynchronous function called fetch data is going to generate another thread, essentially, or similarly, which is going to process things on the side while the rest of the program runs and renders. So this side process is going to go ahead and await this API to return data. It's going to parse the data in JSON format, and then it's going to set the data using our set data from our state inside of this asynchronous function. And what use effect does is it mimics component did mount, and the way we do that is we give it an empty array that tells it to only run once after initial render. So typically use effect could be used in a bunch of different ways, and you can give it criteria for when it runs, but in this case we're only going to run it when the component renders or mounts. And so we're going to run right when the display shows up, we're going to run fetch data, and we're going to fetch the data that we're now returning back to the screen. And then down here we're returning a div with our data, and if data exists, we're going to return our data as a paragraph. If it doesn't exist yet, we're going to return loading. So that's what this question mark colon does. This question mark means if data exists, then show the data. This colon means else, if it's doesn't exist yet, show loading. So that's an example of using state and using effects or side effects. Using context is a little bit more complex. Context allows components to access values externally. So use context is a React hook that allows you to access the value of a context directly within a functional component without having to pass down props. So props are the way, or properties are typically the way that components receive data. The components, the larger components that hold the smaller components inside of them, or the more nested components, will receive data from the less nested components through props typically. However, use context allows all components to access a global set of properties. And so this simplifies the sharing of data across components. When to use, you use it when you need global state, so state that's accessible all throughout. For example, user authentication, themes, and languages. and also to avoid sending properties all the ways down, all these nested components to get down there. So this is an example of use context here. Here in our app, we are creating a theme context using react.createContext. And then we are using a theme context, the provider for this theme context, which is generated when we create our new context with react.createContext. And we're using that provider to provide theme, which is our value, right? So this context is providing this very specific value called theme. And this value could be anything. It could be a string, like this is dark theme. It could be an object with lots of data in it. It could be a lot of different things. But we are passing theme, our variable, into our context using our context provider. And then we create our child component down here, which we're bringing into our larger parent component right here. And what this child component will do is it uses context to find the theme context, which we've provided using the provider, and then it brings the theme, the same variable that we defined up here, into this component without having to pass it as a property. And this will now return the selected theme is theme, because we're able to universally pass down this value of theme using the context wherever we want without having to say child and then give it an attribute called theme is equal to dark. Instead, we're just able to use theme context, and anywhere where we want to use it, we use context. So context is really helpful, but it needs to be used with a grain of salt, because using it too often can essentially create a very inefficient system. So the third part of our presentation today is about responsive design. So before we get into this, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll do a 5-minute break. We'll meet back up at 7:52. So go ahead and take a break, get some water, use the restroom, do whatever you got to do, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay, so we are back. We will be talking about responsive design next. So this is the third part of today's discussion. What is responsive design? Actually, first, does anybody have any questions about state or anything regarding React's state system? Doesn't seem like anybody has any questions. So we're going to jump right into responsive design. So what is responsive design? Responsive design is a web design approach that ensures content adjusts smoothly across a variety of devices. So some key concepts here are fluid grids, fluid elements, flexible images, and media queries. And essentially what these, they're components that we can use in HTML and styling methods. And what these do is they allow us to have a website that changes fluidly and appropriately based on what the screen size is for the site or the application. So an example would be this. This is the Hispanic Hackers website. And whenever we go ahead and I'm wondering, did I share my screen appropriately? Oh, y'all can't see it. Let me switch over to, I wonder if I've done this before. Change windows. I'm going to share my whole screen. Here y'all go. So this is the Hispanic Hackers website. And what we did when we developed this website is we wanted the website to look efficient and beautiful on any screen size. So as you can see here, when we decrease the screen size, we are, oh, can y'all see it now? Should be, Discord is showing it to me.
I can see it.
Okay, sweet. So what we did is as you decrease it, you can see how things kind of change and shrink. For example, here it starts breaking down, and then at a certain point, our header kind of switches focus a little bit. You can see some of the text breaking, but when you get to a small enough frame, it compresses the 4x4 here or 2x2 here into a stack of 4. It also compresses some other content, and then as we continue to decrease, it decreases the size of our text, and then responsively it turns into a whole stacked application like this, where it has a different interface but kind of retains the same style and approach as previously. And so this is a responsive application because no matter what size screen you're looking at it on, you can still see mostly the same content. Another example here is, as you can see, we're showing the Texas heart, but when you get large enough, it's showing the whole world with the Texas heart. So we have it switch to a different image when we get to a certain width. So all of this is basic responsive design. And the way responsive design is changed and modified is using some of these basic principles like fluid grids, fluid elements, flexible images, and media queries. So fluid grids are layout elements that are proportionally sized instead of fixed, and we'll go into that in the next slide. So fluid grids are percentage-based sections or grids or units that we can create in using CSS. So here we have an example with a flex container. So we're using display flex, which is a CSS property, and we are creating a flex grid where each column that has the column class will take up 50% of the container. And so that's specifying how our grid is structured internally. So our container has the display type of flex, and this is the specifications for how each of the items inside of this container interact, which would be each one takes up 50% of the container's width. Meanwhile, we have Flexbox, or using grid in Flexbox. So that's another way. Here we're using percentages, and this is using Flexbox. Meanwhile, down here we're using the grid display version, and this does something much similar, where we are creating an auto-fit repeated grid pattern. And grid can be a little bit complicated just as much as Flexbox. When we are talking about CSS, I like to recommend that people use, I believe it's called CSS. Let me see. If I look up Flexbox like this. That's it, CSS Tricks. I really like CSS Tricks guide to Flexbox properties because they give these really great graphics. And Flexbox is a very important property in CSS for how you structure your data. For example, here we have a set of containers, and we can basically specify the order, which we change the order a lot in our web pages based off of how the size of our web page and the screen sizes, the direction of our items in a section. We can determine if the items grow to take up all the space or if they shrink. We can specify whether or not the items wrap in the case that we have a row. If we have a row and the width gets to be too small to hold the row all by itself, do we have them wrap around to fill in the remaining space? Different properties like this. And CSS Tricks also has guides to other articles about other CSS properties. So it's really helpful, especially when building websites. And so without further ado, that's a brief overview of Grid and Flexbox. Relative font sizes are also very important. Typically use EM or REM units instead of pixels to make the text scale based off of the screen size. So what REM and EM are is that they're units used to proportionally adapt the content so the content looks the same on all screens. Also using viewport units, which basically specify that it's going to use only 5% of the viewport width, or 5% of that window width, is another example. So while percentages take up the amount of space inside of its parent, right? So say the parent is only the enclosing container only is 500 pixels wide. To take up 100% of that width, a child element or an item that's inside of the parent element would take up 500 pixels because it's taking up 100%. To take up 50%, it would be 250 pixels, etc., etc. So percentage is relative to the size of the parent. Meanwhile, viewport width is relative to the size of the screen width or the window width. So if the window is 1000, but the element is inside of a parent that's 500 pixels, 100 viewport width would be 1000 pixels, while 50 viewport width or 50 viewpoint width would be 200 or 500 pixels. So another element of responsive design is creating flexible images. This can be done by sizing images with relative sizing and percentages, like you see here. If you give it a width of 100%, but you maintain an auto height, it will change the size of the image, but it will not change the proportions of the image, so it won't distort the image. Meanwhile, using the max width property is also important. This allows us to give our image a maximum width of 100% with a height of auto, but it will be able to scale accordingly. Another key term that I didn't know until I was making this presentation is using source set. So say you have a couple different images with different resolutions. For example, the small JPEG version is a lot more compressed than the medium one or the large one. You can specify that at 768 width, we increase the resolution of our image and then at 1200 width, we increase it even more, versus we default to a small image. And then you can also change the aspect ratio by providing the image as a background image. So what that'll do is inside of our image container, we'll put a background image of this image, and the image will always exist inside of this container, but using the cover background size, it basically means that that image is going to always expand or contract to be able to fit inside of the container and cover it completely. So a lot of times that means that part of the width or part of the height of the image drops out of the container, but it's nice because it keeps the image always inside of your container and always covering the container. So this is an example of changing the aspect ratio by setting the container's height and width by using background images. Oh, so an example of that would be, for example, here where you can see the background image is shrinking and growing, and you can see how it's kind of hard to see because we have these orange divs on top. But for example, I just deleted one. You can see here the image kind of grows or shrinks and moves in and out of the frame based on how I grow this image. So the way that this works is we have a container with a background image, and the image is set to cover the container as much as possible. So here we're having it cover perfectly, and some of the image drops out at the top and bottom right now, but it's still covering the container. And that's using this background image and background size properties of CSS. So the last thing to note are media queries. Media queries allow us to change the CSS based off of the width of the screen. So for example, when the width becomes 768 pixels or wider, this will change our body's font size to 18 pixels. And when the width becomes 1200 pixels, this media query will change the body's font size to 20 pixels. So what this allows us to do is selectively change the CSS based off of the size of the screen or other properties of our site or our product. Media queries are for CSS, and CSS is only for web applications, so that is one thing to note. Common breakpoints. So breakpoints are the point at which our media queries trigger, and common breakpoints are for small devices, 480 pixels. For medium devices, which are like tablets, 768 pixels. Large devices are 1024 typically, and extra large devices like desktop computers or monitors are 1200 pixels and above. These breakpoints are really important because, for example, Tailwind, which we'll learn about in a second, follow these breakpoints for determining where their media queries increase or decrease or change properties. Media queries allow CSS to apply different styles based off of the design characteristics or device characteristics such as screen size, resolution, and orientation. So now that we've talked about CSS and responsive development and some HTML, we'll move into React.js state, which can be used to manage responsive design. And so this is a single slide about how we can use state to manage the responsive design. However, this goes like really deep, and this is a really great hack when you're trying to develop components and change components based off of the screen width. So, or screen height, or any property of the window and screen. So what we're doing here is we're using use state and use effect. And what this will do is we create a new state with the window's inner width, meaning the window's size. So what is the width of the window of our website? For example, what is the width here of our browser? And we're storing that into screen width when we initialize our state. We also have a function called set screen width, which allows us to change our screen width. Then we're using a use effect to manage a side effect. What this does is it triggers once when the product is rendered. So when we mount and our website renders, so when it shows up, it triggers once, and this will basically create a function called handle resize, which will set the window inner width, or set the screen width to the window's updated width. And this handler right here called handle resize will be triggered when a resize event occurs on the window. So essentially what we're doing is we are setting up an event listener. And what an event listener does is it waits for this event, which is specifically the resize event on our window, and it will trigger our handler by calling this handle resize function. So the resize event on our window occurs when I do this. That just triggered the resize event. And this did it again, and this did it again. And essentially we can trigger our resize event by changing the size of our window. So that's what adding event listeners do, is that it adds a sub-process which is listening and waiting for this event to occur. And when it does, it's calling handle resize, which is setting our screen width to the updated screen width. Here we are using a return listener, a return to our use effect, which basically acts as on component will unmount, which will basically, when the component is unmounting or deleting, it will delete our event listener, so it'll delete our sub-process that's waiting for the resize. Because when the component dies, it says, okay, we don't need this anymore. So that's how we're using use effect, is we are basically setting our state to the window's current width. And then down here, when we're returning our HTML, if the screen width is bigger than our breakpoint, which is 768 pixels, then we'll show desktop view. And if it's not, we'll show mobile view, which this operates very similarly to this image here on the website. So this image here is an image of Texas with a little heart on it. However, when we make our breakpoint, which is here, that Texas with a heart on it changes to a different image, which is this image here, which is our world. And so then when we decrease again, we hit our breakpoint again, and then we end up generating this picture instead. So this works in the exact same way as this code here, where basically when our screen width is greater than 768 or whatever our breakpoint is, we show the world image. And when the screen width is less than that, using the colon here meaning else, in this is the if statement and this is the else we're going to show the Texas with the heart. So that's essentially how you can manage component state using, or manage responsive design with component state. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is CSS frameworks. And we're going to just glaze over these briefly, because what CSS frameworks are is they're very simple. They allow us to basically develop styles and responsive design faster by giving us libraries of pre-written CSS and JavaScript code. So this will allow us to create responsive and aesthetically pleasing web designs. They often include a set of predefined styles, layouts, and UI components. So why do we use them? We use CSS frameworks to speed up development, provide responsive design, provide compatibility across different browsers, and create consistent design and development resources. So providing a uniform look, feel, and experience on our website. And so some popular CSS frameworks are Bootstrap. You might have heard about that one. It's known for its grid system, UI components, and flexibility. Tailwind CSS, which is what I've mentioned previously. Tailwind is really popular because it's a very simple framework which allows us to basically redefine the way we create classes and the way we style our components. Bulma's another one, and it's a responsive framework based off of Flexbox, and then Foundation's another one. But the most popular two I've heard of are Bootstrap and Tailwind. An example of Tailwind looks like this, where instead of defining our CSS properties and our classes inside of, for example, instead of defining our style for our objects as well as our, like inside of a CSS file, we are defining our styles as classes that are already pre-generated by Tailwind. So what Tailwind has done is that it has a library of pre-generated classes. And when I give this div a class of BG Blue 500, it will change the background. It'll basically apply a class which will change the background of this div to a blue color. Here, this changes the text color to white. This changes the padding to 4, which is a specific sizing that Tailwind does. They have kind of a unique styling preset. It'll make the div rounded with a round radius, and it will provide a shadow. And then here we are creating double XL sized text. So instead of giving a pixel size for our text, we give it a general size. And that's essentially how Tailwind works, is it allows us to create custom classes and utility classes like this. So that is Tailwind. And if you're more interested in Tailwind or interested to learn more, our second take-home video this week will be about developing a website using Tailwind in addition to React. And it's a great review of how to build a website as well as how to use Tailwind. So that's it for today. Our lesson for today was relatively quick. We're going to move into project check-ins in a minute, but if y'all can go ahead and fill out your attendance by scanning this QR code, that would be great. Essentially, just scan this QR code, fill out the form. I'll give y'all about 10 minutes to do that, and we'll reconvene at 8:24. Let me know if you have any. Does anybody have any questions? If you have any questions, let me know. Sweet. If y'all don't have any questions, I'll also be available for questions after and during project check-ins. So go ahead and scan that, fill it out, take your time. We'll meet back in 10 minutes.
Hey, is there a link that you may send for the attendance? I'm actually using my phone and can't scan it.
You're good. Let me pull up the link.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Actually, I might have already sent it. No, I haven't. There, I just sent it in the chat. The attendance will essentially just ask you about how you feel about the projects that you're working on. If you aren't working on a project, feel free to skip over that part. And then in addition to that, it will go ahead and ask you how you felt about today's lesson, if you have any additional questions, etc.
What's up? Oh, I'm alright for now.
You like cocktails?
Huh?
I like cocktails.
Yeah, every now and again. Okay. Exactly.
Yeah, but what do you think of that song? Not bad.
It was really good. Send it to me.
Look it up.
Alex, sure. So,
She. HRISHI. I'll send it to you. Oh, that's a sick album cover. I don't know this song. Apple just recommended it to me.
Hey, Alex,
Nice.
just as an FYI, your mic's on.
It's pretty fucking good. I like that song. I was keeping these because like I wanted to like plant shit in it.
Oh, I see.
So I like the mandala. But it's a lot of fucking alcohol. Yeah, my mom was like, "Is that a bottle? I can smell you." And I'm like, "Listen, y'all wanted me to stop smoking." And she's like, "Listen to me, start a new addiction." I'm like, "I'm not addicted."
An addict.
Huh?
That's what addicts say.
I'm an enthusiast.
Okay, it seems like everybody filled out their attendance
I started off my
form.
Twitter fitness
So,
stuff.
hey, Alex.
Reason for selfish.
I think he's has his headphones off.
What language is this?
Possibly.
Tamil. South India.
Tamil?
Yeah.
Huh?
Hindi. Tamil.
Yeah.
That's where I was born, Chennai.
Yeah, because the characters look
Different.
vastly different.
Yeah, it's more Dravidian than Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Tamil.
I say some. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our project check-ins. So essentially, some of y'all are working on the ION project, while some of y'all are working independently. First, we're going to check in with the ION project to see how it's going. One thing I did want to mention is we haven't really had many people have any questions. But we did have a question previously about the legal process for getting a MVP started. So we can talk about that more in the future. Another thing to mention is that the IP lawyer who had come onto our presentation 2 or 3 weeks ago Stephen will be attending next week's meeting in person. So next week is a capstone date for our essentially our program, because it is a time when we all get to present what we've developed, what we've created, and what we're excited about, in addition to having a lecture about some key tech topics. So in terms of next week, what I am asking from y'all is to have a short brand presentation on your project. So there's an example of that in the take-home materials. I can show it to you real quick. This is a very simple version, and if you want to create something that's more interesting or well designed than this, feel free to. But this is an example brand presentation that I would like to see at next week's meeting. Essentially, you have your logo, your slogan, or whatever your project works off of, and then you have your mission on the second panel, your vision for the third panel, your color scheme on the fourth, your fonts on the fifth, logo inspiration on the sixth, and then your logo on the seventh. And so this would be all of your logo formats, would be great. And then finally, how your website is doing. So take some screenshots or export some of your Figma panels and produce some really good views of how your website's going. And this example, again, is on the take-home materials document. So I'd like for everybody who is a leader on a project or working on their own project to work to coordinate the design of this short brand presentation. All it needs is the content that you should have already been designing and have designed. Another part of the homework for this week is to work on your project's website. It would be really great to have a showcase of your website, if possible, at our next meeting. But that would require that you already have it uploaded or can run or can plug in your computer to HDMI. So if you want to bring your computer, go ahead and bring it and plug it in with HDMI at Capital Factory next week. If not, just email me your brand presentation next week before the meeting next week. Don't forget to RSVP for our meeting next week on Meetup. The meeting will be in person. So please note, in person at Capital Factory, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. typical time on Monday. All right, so I would like to start with Ion and then work our way through our attendants who are working on personal projects. So Josh, how is your team doing? How you feeling?
We're doing pretty good. We had a meeting last week. We're going to have one tomorrow, kind of setting it up on Tuesdays. But we have most of the presentation material. I'm not sure we'd be able to get to the, we'll probably have something up. But the design is in Figma, and we have like a wireframe for pretty much the front end, and then also the back end, how apps are going to communicate with each other and whatnot. But we're thinking we might do like a React and React Native.
Perfect.
So we'll have both application and a web app.
Yeah, that would be great. That's kind of the goal, is to be able to practice React Native as well, because although React, all of the concepts are pretty similar to React Native concepts, React Native changes up the jargon a little bit. So yeah, that would be great.
I did have a question about the Vercel. Are we hosting? What is the plan for hosting? And
Yeah.
Can you just go into the details?
So because we're building a Next.js website, our projects are going to be hosted on Vercel, and they will be I think that's actually next week's presentation is on SEO and hosting. So we'll probably have about a 45-minute to hour-long presentation about that. And then in addition to that, we'll do our projects. That's kind of the goal for next week's plan.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. I think we'll be ready for that. And if there's any other follow-ups, I'll definitely reach out to you.
Okay, sounds great. Anybody on Ion's team that have any inputs, any thoughts, anything that they want to announce, anything that they're excited about? Sweet. If y'all have any questions, go ahead.
Sorry.
No
Hey,
worries.
no, I just want to say I was super excited to work on the front end side, and I think we have like a really well balanced team for Ion. Josh, I didn't realize with Figma it's my first time using it, but we were both kind of making changes. Just you were on like the landing page. I think it was you making the changes, and I was I think I was on like the inspiration app and logo section. So I was looking at it earlier in the day, and I noticed we both had like two different things going. So that'll be, we'll talk tomorrow. But yeah, I just want to say we have a pretty good balanced team, and I mean, with learning Figma, it's been a pretty cool experience so far.
That's
definitely a good team. I'm excited to work with everyone. That's one thing that I guess I should ask is about managing the project in Figma. So I like invited everybody to a project, and I have like 3 pages, and so I have like the main page that has wireframe, and then another page that has like logo inspiration, and then like the mission and a few other things, I think. Yeah, how would you suggest managing that, Andreas?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Essentially, the Figma free membership allows you to have up to 3, I think, projects and then unlimited amount of drafts. So those projects are what you can share with other people. I would say just create one project, and then as inside of that project, for example, I can show you what my Figma looks like. I'm using Figma for this presentation. Here what I have is I have a page of templates. So these are the templates I use to build my presentation with. You can see, the basic cover slide, the overview slide, title, and then other portions here. And then what I'll go ahead and do is I will change I'll bring in my components here. So each one of these is a container, right? Each one of these is a section or a frame, and inside of that frame I have my component. So I can drop my component in, I can change the slide type if I want to. And then if I want to change the content that overlays the slide, for example, here I have my slide component, but then I have a frame on top of that. All of that is inside of my main frame. So what I would recommend is if you have branding and design content, bring those into your branding. Bring that into a specific page for branding and design, and then add in another page for components. So all of these components that you create that can be switched out, change those, bring those in, create components, maybe sort it out that way, and then have your individual pages or your individual deliverables as separate pages, if that makes sense.
I could essentially do a frame for each person, or we could all have our own frame so that we could do changes and then vote on, or like we'll just make changes to an individual frame that won't affect all the components. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's the greatest thing is I would suggest assigning people to do specific components or create specific frames, and then have everybody just discuss what what your end goal is to look like for this website. So I would assign personally 1 or 2 people on building out the actual components, and then I'd assign a couple other people on sketching what they want the website to be outlined and what information they want on that website while those components are being built, and then to bring those components into the product. So that's how I would outline, I'd like kind of lay it out. But it really it depends on your skill set as a team and how you want to collaborate. That's up to you, Josh.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going in that direction. I appreciate you.
Of course. I'm glad that y'all are doing well and excited about it. I'm really excited to see what y'all come up with, and next meeting is going to be good. So I'm excited.
Nice. Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Let me know if you all have any questions. If you want to stick around for questions after this meeting, you can stick around. If not, if you're all good, feel free to jump off, but maybe somebody will ask a question that you have or it might be beneficial to you. So I do recommend staying on. Okay, any other questions so far? Without getting into other people's bring your own projects yet. Okay, sweet. Let's go ahead and move through the attendance. Today is the 11th, so we have Nicolas. How is your project going?
It's going well. I've been, like I said, I've been working on it for about a month now. So I got like the user authentication working. I got like adding a friend feature working. So now I'm kind of just working on like integrating the actual betting feature.
Mhm.
So I'm using Stripe for that, and it's been going good. Just trying to figure it out. Just kind of reading documentations and slowly trying to get it to work.
That's awesome. So, do you want to give a little bit background for everybody on what your project is and what you're developing?
Yeah, so basically the whole point was because, me and my friend used to work out all the time. And ever since he moved away, we can't hold each other accountable. So we kind of came up with an idea where we essentially just set bets up with each other. Like, hey, I bet you $5 that I can go to the gym 5 times a week. And then he'll also throw in $5. So basically say we do accomplish that goal. We keep our $5, and let's say he misses 2 days, right? Essentially it'll be $1 a day, since it's $5 divided by the number of days you want to go. So it'll be $1 a day. So if he misses 2 days, I'll get the $2. So I take home $7, where he'll take home 3. That's kind of the whole gist of it. Just kind of like a betting app for you and your friend to hold each other accountable.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's cool that you're getting Stripe integrated and everything. Let me know if you have any questions or anything that I can help with.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Sweet. Next up on our attendance form is Jeff. How's your project going?
Hi, Andreas. This is Jeff. Remember, I was at the hackathon the last 2 weekends, so honestly, I'm not very far on my project, but it's pretty straightforward. It's just to put the if you have your own septic system, live out in the country, and the paperwork you have to submit to the county. It's 7 questions.
Gotcha. Yeah, you have been talking to me about that one. So essentially for next meeting, the goal is to have a presentation with some brand standards and some marketing content. So at the very minimum, if you could come up with a catchy name and maybe design a little logo or something along those lines. You can also use, if you're not fond of Inkscape, you can use Canva or Photopea or some other applications that are listed in our resources to build that. But that's awesome. Are you going to be able to attend next meeting in person?
Yeah, I should be able to. Fortunately, that's my birthday, so.
Oh, gotcha. That's awesome.
Yeah, unfortunately, the parts you want to see on Monday are not my strongest skills, but I'll see what I can do.
Do your best.
Thinking of starting more on the website part, but it makes sense how you have it ordered.
Yeah, do your best and do what you can do. I would say, if anything, make sure that you have a solid color palette and some basics for it. But it can be very simple, and that's kind of the goal, is just play by your skill set. But let me know if you have any questions or anything I can help with.
Yeah, we'll talk online. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Next is Alex. How's it going?
So far, so good. So currently with my projects, I am basically figuring out like the different technologies that are going to be used in it.
Mhm.
So it still has a ways to go, but it's getting there.
Yeah. Gotcha. Were you able to create the marketing content for it yet?
Not as of yet. Last week has just been a bit of a mess. So thankfully, I should have a lot more free time this week. So I should have um, some work done.
Yeah, as long as you've got something to show next week, that would be great. Because I'm excited about those presentations, and I think everybody else is too. So, do you want to give everybody a quick shout out about what your project is?
Oh yeah. So the project that I'm basically working on, I am. It really centers around me just wanting to pick up more languages. So I have used various browser extensions, like Language Reactor is a notable one that basically uses like machine translated subtitles to accurately, you know, transcribe what the characters are saying in any dub. Because one thing I have noticed in a lot of streaming platforms is, although they do provide different languages in terms of the audio, sometimes the subtitles don't sync up, like whether it be due to regional differences or just the writers' room for the dub languages decided to go a different route due to timing. Hopefully, with this app, browser extension, it can solve that. I really wanted to focus more on browsers such as Firefox, though, because there's plenty of that on Google Chrome, but I prefer Firefox.
Nice. Yeah, so we're excited about that. I would love to see some like branding stuff at the next meeting, but no pressure. Do what you can do, and just anything that you have for next meeting would be great.
Sure thing.
Let me know if you have any questions, anything I can help with. More than happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you, Andres.
Yeah, of course. Okay, next up is Nancy. How's your project going? And if you want to give everybody an explanation of what you're working on real quick, you're more than welcome to.
Hey, yeah, so I am currently working on a website for a local business. It's a bakery, and I have the logo done. Still working on the color scheme, like I'm kind of indecisive. I've already built the basis of the website. I have a drawn out on paper, old fashioned wireframe, but I'm trying to do that on Figma.
Mhm.
I'm just having complications because haven't used it very much. But yeah, that's what I'm working on, and haven't gotten to do too much on it, honestly, because I've had a lot going on, but I'm definitely working on it, and I have like a list of components that I want to use and that kind of go with what today's lessons have been.
Nice. That's great. Do you have any questions or anything like that?
Most of them are on Figma, but I think I'll just go off of what you were telling our first project
Yeah.
team members.
So the core concepts of Figma are creating those, basically creating the components. So a lot like how React is structured, we create components in Figma. So here my slide is my component, and I've created several different variations of my slide based off of which component I'm using. So here's my slide, the title component, or title variation, itinerary variation, etc. And you can do that just by creating your object and then coming down here and clicking. They recently changed this.
Yeah, I just updated it today, and it's a
it's
little
over here.
different too.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of annoying that they switched everything around on us. But if you come up here to create component, it'll turn into component. If you want to add a new variation, you just come up here and hit add variant. You can change the property type and the name of that property here. And then you can copy and paste these components to use them wherever you want, which is cool. And then they'll be modeled off of our components up here. So this program for all of y'all is moving pretty fast, but the goal is to keep everybody on a solid pace because we cover a lot in this boot camp, and you're going to get a ton of things thrown at you at once. But the goal is that you retain as much as possible and are able to come out of this with some really cool projects. So I hope that helps assure everybody.
Andres,
Yes.
I did have a question on like why use Inktree? I know you mentioned it like it's good for SVG and whatnot, different file structures for the logos. So like Inktree versus Figma, what's the real reasoning for that decision? Logo design.
So Figma is a wireframing application, so it is more designed to develop wireframed prototypes. So it allows interactivity and great design options. However, for example, if I create text here and I type something like code Foundry, this item is just text and it's only ever going to be text. Versus when I open up Inkscape, which I can do really quickly. Let me see, where do I have Inkscape stored? I think I actually have it down here.
Go to Windows spacebar.
Here we go. It's opening up right now. But when I open up Inkscape, I'll open up this. Okay. Wait, print. When I open up Inkscape, it gives me a lot more options because it allows me to draw. And so does Figma. But for example, a key example is with text. Text, I can create my text. And then what I can do is I can convert the text into an SVG object. And that is done by going to object, and then, is it object? Path. Object to path. Like this. And now this text becomes a bunch of adjustable SVG models instead of text. So then you can add stylization techniques to our text. And so say I don't like how this curves, I can drag this piece up right here and I can adjust it and I can create my own variation of this font for my logo specifically. So the difference is that Inkscape is for creating SVGs, which are the most common and basic form of vector graphic images. And the reason why we use vector graphics is that they're precise. They're not pixels, they are mathematical models. And so no matter how much I zoom in, it's always going to be smooth and a flat curve because we are using mathematical models to model that curve instead of pixels. So there's no resolution there. Meanwhile, using Figma's for prototyping and wireframing. So what we use Figma for is for implementing our SVGs with other components to make a prototype which might not be an SVG. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. I think you can export still as SVG, but it's not going to be the same. So that's that's the idea.
I
hear you there.
Question.
Yes.
So using Inkscape, don't close out of it yet.
Yeah.
How did you choose which form to use? Because there's a bunch. There's for a business card, and there's for a Facebook post, and there's a ton. But to create the logo, which one would you recommend?
So there's a bunch, like you were saying. Let me see. Oh, I think that closed out of Inkscape completely. I'll open up the options again. Inkscape is here. So there's a bunch. I usually go with one that's kind of big. So like if I'm doing a logo or a business card, I'll do like the landscape. Or if I'm doing not just a logo, I'll open up like the landscape one. And what I'll
Okay.
do is I will create the cool thing is, and the whole point of why we use SVGs is that they're scalable. They're scalable vector graphics. So no matter how big or small you make them, they're always perfect because they're made up of mathematical models. So I always choose a big one. I design whatever I want on that big one that looks good.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I export it, instead of, I go to this export panels here, when I export it, instead of saying document or page, I hit selection. So you can see in this bar here, it's only exporting what I've selected instead of exporting the whole document, or page, which would look a lot bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to add to that, how would you be able to make it so that it doesn't have like the white background, like where it's clear?
Yeah. So right now this doesn't have a white background because I'm only exporting the selected. The white background is only there right now as a general guideline. But for example, it's just giving us contrast, and you can change what that color is for the background in the properties, but it doesn't get transferred over to your final design. For example, here you can see the final design is a PNG or a transparent background. It has a transparent background, so you don't carry over that background color. If you wanted to add a background color that does get carried over, you'd have to put for example, a square on top of that, or like a rectangle, and then move this
Bring
down
to back.
as a layer, right? Like
Yeah.
that. Wait. So pull can be finicky sometimes, but pulling this layer up. Well, it doesn't want to do it right now, but you understand the general concept.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be how you do that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'm going to move on to, we have 2 more people, I believe. We have Michael. Michael, how is your project going? I don't know if Michael's here. Did he? Oh,
Which
yeah.
Michael? I've seen another Michael on here. Are you saying Michael Rodriguez or?
Yeah, Michael Rodriguez.
Oh, okay, yeah. Like I said, I've been emailed. You responded back to me about the project being, that team project being built.
You're
And then
right.
you said to just like my own project. I haven't gotten started yet, but I have a few ideas to guess what I want to do. But we'll have to use a Figma and then do design and stuff, and then see if it's something that I want to build out.
Yeah, that makes total sense. There's no pressure. We are meeting next Monday to just again go over projects, and then also have another lesson. That one is in person. So if you can have anything, even just a project idea that you want to bring to that, please do. In the comments right now, I just posted the document for our take-home content. So this is where you're going to get your take-home videos, as well as the homework checklist and all of the videos that we've had for our meetings, etc. So our meetings are on here, our take-home videos are on here, all of the resources are on here. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in Discord or at hispanichackersboard@gmail.com, and I'm happy to help and answer them. If you can, at your earliest convenience, just send me what your project is going to be. And then if you want to create anything for next meeting, that would be great. But it's up to you.
Yeah, I have a pre-built website, but it's like it's not built on Next JS. It's built on the framework. But the only hard part is gonna be is transferring that, like some parts of it to the Next.js.
Yeah.
So I'll probably have some questions about that.
Yeah, definitely. Let me know what comes to mind with that. What framework is it built on? Is it on like Vue or Angular?
Hold on. Oh, is that what's it called?
Laravel, WordPress. There's a whole bunch. There's too many frameworks. We need to get rid of some.
It's like
Django,
CodeWriter.
CodeWriter. I don't think I heard of
Yeah,
that one. Huh? That's a new one for me.
I think that was the. I think it's for a class, but I've been using it to build out my first website. I mean, official website.
That's awesome. Well, let me know if you have any questions or need any help. I'm more than happy to answer anything that I can about it. And I can probably wrap my head around it if you have a more specific question. But yeah, all good. Just you're new to the class, so just take it step by step, you know?
Yeah.
But yep, all good. And then is Pedro here? I think he might have left. I think he left early. He's leaving for the Dominican Republic in a couple of days, so he's not going to be able to join us in our meeting. But I think that covers everything. We basically spent the whole 2 hours, and that's awesome. That's like the goal. Every time when I'm writing these presentations, I think to myself, I have 2 hours to fill. How am I going to fill 2 hours? And then I also think to myself, how do I not fill 2 hours or like 3 with all this content? So good job. I'm patting myself on the back. Anyways, if y'all have any questions, feel free to let me know. If not, class is dismissed.
I think you did great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice night.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Appreciate all the help, Andres. Sorry for earlier, but
Oh, you're good.
yeah. So far, yeah, I'm really enjoying the presentations. So
I'm glad. If you have
very
any,
informative.
yeah, if you have any questions that you want on there, just feel free to either include them in the attendance form or message me. I'm always happy to answer anything that like is on our minds, you know?
Yeah, I do have one question actually. It was in the attendance form for today, but I guess I'll go ahead and ask. Regarding using cloud technology, is it common or is it uncommon for people to use different cloud services, like using a mixture of Azure, AWS, et cetera, to lower the cost of a certain product?
Yes. So a lot of companies do that because AWS gives you a certain amount of credits. So does Azure and Google Cloud, and they're pretty greedy with it, right? They like to get you hooked in the first year so that you're stuck using their platform. But when startups are created, you're trying to use your resources as efficiently as possible. So a lot of developers and entrepreneurs will essentially mix and match. I've seen like using Firebase, which is part of Google Cloud's platform, mixed in with AWS's S3 buckets. And these companies basically get these dev and cloud platforms up working together just to be able to get through the first year so that they could just start making money.
Okay.
But at a certain point, you're going to want to stick with a specific cloud provider because cloud providers provide the opportunity to have free metrics and be able to determine how your app is doing. And if those metrics are scattered in multiple different cloud products, it's going to be really hard to bring them together and tie them together, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it does.
So
actually, you mean like in a financial standpoint, or in terms of just like just keeping up with all the data around usage?
I would say all of the above. You know, three different service providers means 3 different bills to pay, you know, and 3 different code bases to manage because each one of those service providers are going to have updates to their code base that you're using and importing and in your API, and you're using their APIs. So it ends up accumulating what we call tech debt, and that's basically it. Is it's like you end up causing yourself more work in the future.
Okay.
But it's easy to sacrifice that when you don't know if your product's going to work out in the future. So that's why entrepreneurs take a bet on it usually.
Okay.
Yeah. But
that makes sense.
We'll talk more about that when we get into deployment and DevOps, which is one of the last weeks. It's like the last couple weeks we start talking about AWS and all of that. But yeah,
Okay. Sounds like a plan. Well, I appreciate it.
yeah. Any other questions?
That's about it for now.
Sweet, awesome. Well, I hope you have a great week. If y'all are all good, I'm gonna jump off and have some dinner.
I hear that, man. You have a great week too.
Great, thanks. See y'all.
Good
See
night.
y'all on Monday.
For sure.
Hoi.